Strong and sinister feelings like envy and ravenous greed frequently push people to commit crimes. These emotions have the power to form a terrifying, deadly intent when combined with unchecked lust and an obsession with controlling other people. This is a frightening idea, made even more sinister when these feelings are harbored privately within a family. This story takes place in a Sydney suburb and centers on the Lynn family, a sizable and ostensibly harmonious household. As their tale developed, it turned into one of the most notorious and brutal murders in Australian history. Given that the offender became increasingly confident in his ability to elude punishment, the investigation's intricacy and length are remarkable. His carefully thought out and brutally carried out plan was almost perfect, but a small detail that was missed finally provided the necessary breakthrough for the police. Now let's go back to the start of this story and examine how a combination of greed, envy of other people's success, and corrupt passion can turn someone into a monster who didn't even think twice before going on a rampage. Min Lin and Yun Lily, the Lin family story, a portrait of love, ambition, and tragic end. In the late 1980s, while attending an Australian university for their college education, Lin's love story started. Both Chinese natives, Lily and Min, had left their home country to pursue higher education independently. Lily had done so through an exchange program, while Min, 2 years her senior, had stayed on for a professional internship after earning his bachelor's degree. They eventually recalled it as love at first sight after their paths crossed in a university hallway. They felt like outsiders in a foreign country despite having similar origins and dreams, but their desire to establish a new life in Australia brought them together. Following graduation, the pair got married and made North Epping, a serene and lovely suburb of Sydney, their new home. Their enduring love grew into a big, close-knit family that was devoted to and deeply connected to one another. Their first child, June Brenda Lynn, who went by her middle name Brenda most of the time, was born in August 1994. Their eldest child, Terry, was born in 2000, and their son Henry was born in 1997. As the new millennium approached, Min and Yun made the decision to start a business and set up a little newsstand. Their commitment turned this little beginning into a successful news organization with a publishing division located on Rose Street. Due to the Lynn family's successful business, they were able to afford a luxurious car, a large home, and their kids' prestigious private education. While Yun devoted her time to raising their children and taking care of the house, Min concentrated on business matters. The Lyns were highly respected in their community for their diligence, generosity, and friendliness. They had a reputation for being model, loving parents who never got into arguments. Their eldest child, Brenda, was exceptionally beautiful, a stellar student, and had a kind heart for animals. Henry and Terry, the boys, were enthusiastic, sports-loving boys who had a similar love for soccer. The siblings were practically inseparable from one another and had a strong bond. Moving relatives from China to Australia, as the Lynn family became established and prosperous financially in Australia, they extended invitations to their Chinese family to come visit, reside, or even stay for a long time. Min's parents were the first to relocate to North Epping in the early 2000s. They lived close by and assisted with the kids. On the weekends, Min's father worked at their newsstand as well. A few years later, Yun's parents moved to a suburb of Sydney as well, and Min and Yun bought them a modest home. Irene, Yun's sister, moved in with the Lyns to help with the kids and household duties. The Lynn family business was reportedly making close to $1 million a year by this point in time. Their business had grown beyond a store or publishing house to become a community center where people congregated to read and talk about news over coffee. In search of better prospects in the vibrant metropolis of Sydney, Kathy Lynn, née Shi, and her husband, Liam bin Robert Shi, relocated to Australia towards the end of 2007. They had previously traveled to Australia to see relatives and had lived briefly in Melbourne before moving back to China. They were resolved to make Australia their permanent home this time. Robert, a former prosperous ENT physician in China, made the decision to attempt entrepreneurship as a career change. Investing all of their savings, the Edzies launched their own restaurant in Sydney, but it failed to take off and closed down quickly. Attempts to open a snack bar or cafe after that also fell through. Robert struggled in his new endeavors because he lacked financial management skills and business acumen. Robert and Kathy eventually relocated to North Epping in order to be closer to family. Kathy was able to secure employment, but Robert was still in a state of self-discovery and was unsure of his future. Strong friendship as well as kinship bound the families of she and Lynn. They kept in close contact, saw each other practically every day, and frequently got together for meals as a family. The last time they got together like this was on Friday, July 17, 2009, in the evening at Kathy and Min's parents' house. They had no idea that this would be their last get-together. The Lynn family home, the scene of a gruesome massacre. The regular customers were taken aback when the Lynn family's shop unexpectedly closed on July 18th. The store, which had been open 7 days a week for years, had no indication that it would open and had no warning signs on the doors. This strange incident alarmed both customers and nearby store owners. One of them called his sister Kathy to find out what was going on after trying to reach Min multiple times without success. Knowing that her brother had never closed the shop for a day without making plans and frequently had their father or father-in-law cover for him, Kathy was taken aback and concerned at the same time. She attempted to contact both Min and his spouse, Yun, but to no effect. They did not pick up when she called their home phone either. Fearing for their safety, Kathy and her spouse, Robert, made the decision to stop by Min's place. When they got there at around 9 in the morning, they saw the family car in the driveway and discovered that the front door was unlocked, but there was no one home. There was an unsettling silence inside the house, and no one answered calls for the family members. There were no indications of forced entry, and the house looked undisturbed. Kathy climbed to the second floor and called out for her brother once more. She screamed in shock and horror as she opened Min and Yun Lin's bedroom door and staggered back at the horrific scene in front of her. Blood covered the floor, walls, ceiling, furniture, and curtains in the room. Yun Lin, 43, was found dead next to the bed, his body severely disfigured. The scene was equally horrifying in the room next to Yun's sister, 39-year-old Irene, where she was sleeping. With a bloody pulp on her face, Irene lay lifeless in her bed. 12-year-old Henry and 9-year-old Terry had also been killed by severe beatings in their bedrooms. Their bodies lay in various parts of the space. Brenda, the 15-year-old daughter, was thankfully not home during the tragic night because she had been away on a school trip the day before. There was a slim chance that Min Lin, the head of the household, was still alive and had either escaped, been taken hostage, or suffered an injury because his body was nowhere to be found. Kathy dialed 911 right away, but she was in such a state of shock that she had trouble explaining what had happened. She begged for help to come as soon as possible and attempt to save as many people as possible as she cried and screamed into the phone. Nevertheless, at the scene of the massacre, the first responders could only confirm that every victim had died. The morning after, a startling finding after Kathy made a panicked call to 911, Robert headed out to pick up the Lynn parents, who were approximately 10 kilometers away from the scene of the crime. Within minutes, the police and paramedics arrived, and what they saw was instantly dubbed one of the most horrifying crime scenes they had ever seen. Unfortunately, for any of the Lynn family members, it was too late. A heavy blunt object, similar to a hammer, had been used to strike each victim multiple times, killing them. The deadly weapon, however, was nowhere to be discovered, which led investigators to believe that the offender had taken it with them. Eventually, a blood-soaked blanket covered Min Lin's body, which was found in his bedroom. He had been killed by beatings, just like his family. He seemed to be the first victim, then his wife, then her sister, and then the two boys. Upon preliminary examination of the crime scene, no noteworthy leads or clues were found. Because there was no deadly weapon present and money and valuables were unharmed, it was clear that killing the Lynn family was the main goal instead of robbing them. As it seemed improbable that one person could defeat so many, multiple attackers were initially suspected. Bloodstains and splatters found throughout the house, however, suggested that the kids had been awake and had made a valiant attempt to flee during the attack. It's interesting to note that every adult victim had signs of strangulation in addition to head injuries, maybe to reduce resistance during the attack. Every room had the same bloody shoe prints, each with its own tread pattern. The only thing that could be identified was the size of the shoes, not the brand. The absence of extraneous fingerprints indicates that the murderer or murderers wore gloves. Families, friends, and neighbors all agreed that the Lynns had no known enemies, so at first there were no leads or theories regarding who the perpetrator might be. It was still unknown why 5 people were brutally murdered. It was determined that the attack occurred between 3 in the morning and midnight. July 18th. At the time of the tragedy, the eldest and only survivor of the large Lynn family, Brenda Lynn, was traveling with her guardians on a school trip to New Caledonia. When she first heard about the horrifying event on social media, she didn't think it had anything to do with her own family and thought there had to be some sort of error. Soon after, her Aunt Kathy called to confirm the terrible news while sobbing. Brenda was swiftly returned to Sydney via plane, where she was met at the airport by her new guardians, Kathy and Robert. As the Lynn family home was sealed off as a crime scene, Brenda moved in with them. Brenda, distraught, was taken to the police station the following day to be questioned. She insisted that her family had no enemies or ill-wishers and that they had not noticed anything out of the ordinary prior to her trip, but she was unable to provide any new information. Brenda inherited a sizable fortune after her family passed away, along with real estate and the family company. But since she was still a minor and attending school, Aunt Kathy and her husband Robert served as her legal guardians and were in charge of overseeing the estate. Although Brenda's grandparents also offered assistance, Kathy and Robert insisted on taking care of her in the main. Robert even threatened to file a lawsuit, claiming the elderly relatives were too old to raise a teenager if they applied for custody. After a peaceful resolution was reached, Brenda continued to live with her aunt and uncle. Brenda hadn't taken over running the business yet, so the Z family quickly reopened Lynn's shop and publishing company after it had been temporarily closed. Robert also started diligently going through the family's savings, real estate, bank accounts, and other possessions. Experts in investigation and theories examined the crime scene several times, recording every detail with great care. They tried, but no solid leads materialized. They reasoned that since the murderer most likely entered the house silently and acted alone, there may have been an unlocked door, or the culprit may have had a key. The murderer wore distinctive, elaborately treaded sized 9.5 shoes. The deadly weapon, thought to be a hammer, was never discovered within or near the residence. Because the murderer wore gloves, only traces of the 5 victims' DNA and no fingerprints were discovered. One odd but important detail was that bloodstains were discovered on the doorknobs in every bedroom where the murders took place, suggesting that the killer's bloodstained gloves had come into contact with them. The lack of bloodstains on Brenda's room's doorknob, however, suggests that the murderer was aware that she wasn't there. Being one of the most well-known cases in Australia, the tragic event received extensive media coverage. Numerous unlikely theories surfaced in the absence of any solid evidence or suspects. There were rumors that the Lynn family's enormous wealth was the cause of their passing. There were rumors of a heist gone bad and even the involvement of Chinese mafia clans in the area. Considering the history of a burglary gang in the area, such theories weren't completely discarded. Men had seen an armored car robbery a week prior to the deadly incidents, and the Lynn shop had been attacked months before the tragedy. It was thought that men may have been disqualified as a witness even though the criminals were disguised and he was unable to identify them. The investigation was at a standstill for several months. Not a single theory was verified, and no one was identified as a suspect. After it was determined that money and valuables had not been touched and that the murderer's only goal had been to kill the household members, the robbery theory was eventually discarded. Furthermore, the fact that the house's electricity was turned off the night of the tragic event suggests that the murderer was aware of the location of the electrical panel. The attacker appeared to have been there before and was familiar with the layout of the house, based on their familiarity with it in total darkness. Maybe even getting a key ahead of time. An important overlooked clue: an investigator kept listening to Kathy's emergency call while going over the confusing case details for the 100th time in an attempt to find any missed clue. Unexpectedly, that tape contained a crucial hint. Kathy's frantic attempts to explain the circumstances were captured on tape, her words stuttering and being cut off by sobs and cries. When the operator concluded the call and confirmed that emergency services were on their way, Kathy said her husband's name out of the blue, adding a few words in Cantonese and addressing him personally. The investigator was intrigued by this detail and decided to translate her words. As it turned out, Kathy was begging her husband to keep her company when she was alone in the house. This was noteworthy because, prior to the arrival of the police, Robert had made the independent decision to pick up the Lynn parents, leaving Kathy at the graphic crime scene. Robert appeared to be acting very suspiciously. Kathy could have been a target because the killer might still be inside the house after 5 people were brutally removed. Still, Robert seemed composed and just walked away, as though he knew his wife would not suffer any harm. The primary suspect and new evidence, Robert Jai, was the only person the police could eventually identify as a suspect after several fruitless months. Shortly before the tragedy, it was found that he had a key to his brother-in-law's house, given to him just in case. Strangely enough, Kathy was not aware that her brother had given her husband a key, and Robert never brought up this subject during interrogations. Brenda unwittingly gave the investigators access to this vital piece of information. Subsequent examination demonstrated that Robert's assertion of being a prosperous ENT physician was a charade. Despite having a degree in medicine, he never held a position that was secure in the industry. There were rumors that he left China and fled to Australia to avoid being prosecuted for bribery. Robert wasted the last of his savings on failures as a businessman, failing to make a name for himself in Australia. He was virtually penniless after moving to North Epping, depending on his wife's earnings and sporadic support from Kathy's family. Following the completion of Brenda's guardianship paperwork, Robert pretended to be the heir to the Lynn family's fortune. Even though the house was legally registered in the deceased's name, his first action was to evict Yun's parents from the home that Min had purchased for them. The home that was purchased for Min and Kathy's parents was still occupied. Investigators conjectured that, in light of these facts and circumstances, Robert was motivated by a deep-seated jealousy of his wife's wealthier and more successful relatives, and that he had a long-standing scheme to appropriate their assets, cash, and profitable business. Even though Brenda and Kathy shared a roof with the person who had committed the crime against her family, they weren't thought to be in immediate danger. Brenda had no idea what her cohabitants' real motivations were. Robert, however, required Kathy to keep control of the family's possessions. But since there wasn't enough solid evidence to convict Robert yet, the police were unable to do so. Interrogation, surveillance, and arrest. In an effort to obtain the evidence necessary to establish Robert's guilt, the investigation team was granted permission to place multiple covert cameras within the Z household. The breakthrough occurred sooner than anticipated, beginning with Kathy's unwarranted disclosure during questioning. Kathy brought up her husband's love of a specific shoe brand. A few years ago, Robert had bought 2 pairs of sneakers from a special edition line that he thought was really cool. One pair was worn out and thrown away, but the other was still in its box at their house, lovingly kept. Interestingly, Robert's shoes were the same size as the murderer's, 9.5. The most important piece of evidence was when Robert was seen on one of the covert cameras methodically demolishing the shoebox. A new pair of size 9.5 sneakers were discovered in the suspect's home after this footage led to the issuance of a search warrant. These shoes' tread pattern matched the prints discovered at the scene of the crime. Plus, there was a tiny, smeared trace in his garage that looked like blood. The DNA of all 5 Lynn family victims was found in the bloodstain, which was verified by forensic analysis and directly connected to the crime scene. Robert's arrest resulted from this evidence, which at last gave the authorities the hard evidence they required to move further. A trial, an arrest, and startling discoveries. 2 years after the horrific events, in May 2011, Robert Z. was apprehended as a result of evidence. He angrily denied any knowledge of it, saying the blood in his garage appeared after they got back from the Lynn residence. In addition, he downplayed the importance of the sneakers he had on hand that had the same tread pattern, claiming they were brand new and that he had thrown the old pair away right away. Robert spent 3 years in prison awaiting trial and inadvertently shared cells with multiple informants. During one such conversation, he admitted to having carefully planned the crime and concealed his tracks. He described drugging his wife with sedatives and tea to keep her from waking up and noticing his absence, as well as purchasing the deadly weapon in a far-off store without security cameras. He made sure the hammer, shoes, gloves, and clothes were disposed of in a way that would make them unfindable. Robert refuted all of the allegations made against him during the trial. The only proof used against him was the testimony of his fellow inmates and the previously mentioned circumstantial evidence. Consequently, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous decision, and in December 2015, Robert was released on bond. When the trial recommenced in June 2016, a second informant testified that Robert had admitted to having an obsession with Brenda since she was 13. This prompted a re-examination of Brenda, who revealed, through tears, that not long after moving in with them, Robert had forced her into a sexual relationship. She had kept quiet about the abuse for years out of fear of reprisals. After taking into account additional information and these revelations, Robert Z. was found guilty of all charges. For each of the 5 fatal crimes, he was given a life sentence without the possibility of release.